A transport plane crosses the Austrian Alps. November morning, 1951. Four American airmen monitor instruments, check coordinates, maintain radio contact with Frankfurt. Routine flight, routine procedures, routine altitude. The pilot adjusts for turbulence while the navigator plots their course toward Belgrade. Coffee thermos passing between crew positions. Someone mentions the weather clearing. Below them, the border between free Europe and the Soviet bloc lies invisible beneath scattered clouds. 30,000 feet down, Hungarian radar operators watch a blip drift across their screens. Unauthorized, unannounced, American. What the crew doesn't know is that strong southwest winds have been pushing them steadily off course for the past 40 minutes. That the invisible line separating Western airspace from Soviet-controlled territory now lies behind them. That Hungarian interceptors are scrambling with orders to bring them down. And that two Soviet MiG-15 pilots are preparing to accomplish what the Hungarians cannot. 3 hours later, the C-47 sits on foreign tarmac at Papa Air Base. Propellers still, engines cooling in November air. Crew surrounded by armed soldiers speaking languages they don't understand. Soviet intelligence officers climb aboard with clipboards and cameras, beginning a systematic search that will continue for days. What they find inside will trigger encrypted communications racing between Moscow, Budapest, and Washington. Equipment in perfect working order. Communication systems still warm from contact with American military radio, and evidence of something the crew desperately tried to hide in the moments before the aircraft doors opened. The official designation was Douglas C-47A, registration 4316026, a workhorse of military aviation since 1943. To the four Americans who flew it that morning, it was routine transport. Erding to Belgrade, nothing classified, nothing unusual. To Hungarian air defense, it was sovereign violation requiring immediate response. To Soviet officers examining every compartment with methodical patience, it was something far more valuable, a window into American operations across Europe. The navigator had checked his instruments twice before departure. Weather briefing mentioned winds, nothing significant. The route was familiar, the procedures standard, the destination friendly. Yugoslavia under Tito had broken from Moscow, making Belgrade a crucial channel between East and West. None of that would matter once the MiGs appeared. This was November 19th, 1951. The Cold War at its coldest, its most paranoid. Korea burning, Europe divided by concrete and ideology. The skies above the Iron Curtain transformed into invisible battlefields where compass error became international incident, where four men on routine mission became prisoners of a system designed to extract every secret from captured assets, and where a single aircraft forced onto foreign soil could expose the hidden architecture of American intelligence that Washington had spent years building in shadow. This is the story of how a navigation error became an intelligence catastrophe, how routine transport concealed surveillance capability, and how four airmen carrying equipment they barely understood handed Soviet analysts a blueprint of American operations across an entire continent. It's about the invisible war fought not with bullets, but with instruments. Radio frequencies monitored, flight paths analyzed, every captured aircraft a classroom where enemies studied each other's methodology with the patience of scholars dissecting ancient texts. And it reveals something that both superpowers understood but never acknowledged publicly. That secrecy was fragile. That the machinery of intelligence, painstakingly constructed over years, could be compromised in a single afternoon by wind patterns and compass drift. That somewhere in the sky, above every contested border, flew aircraft carrying secrets that would reshape the conflict if they ever touched hostile ground. The C-47 forced down at Papa wasn't just a plane. It was a time capsule of American capability, delivered intact to the one adversary most eager to examine its contents. Understanding what the Soviets found requires understanding what that aircraft represented and the world that made its mission necessary. In November 1951, Europe existed as two continents occupying the same geography. The line dividing them ran invisible through forests and farmland, marked not by walls but by radar installations and fighter squadrons on permanent alert. Cross that line without authorization, and you entered a world where different rules applied, where foreign aircraft became legitimate targets, where captured crew became intelligence assets to be processed with the same systematic efficiency applied to any other recovered material. The Cold War had reached its coldest temperature. Korea burned through its second year. American and Chinese forces locked in stalemate, while diplomats exchanged threats that carried the weight of nuclear possibility. Stalin ruled the Soviet Union with paranoid absolutism, seeing American conspiracy in every border crossing, every diplomatic communication, every unexplained radar contact. His satellite states operated under standing orders. Unauthorized Western aircraft were to be intercepted, forced down if possible, destroyed if necessary. Hungary occupied a peculiar position in this architecture of suspicion. Landlocked, bordered by Austria to the west and the Soviet Union's most loyal satellites to the east, it served as buffer zone and surveillance platform simultaneously. Soviet forces maintained permanent presence on Hungarian soil, their MiG squadrons ready to respond to incursions that the Hungarian Air Force couldn't handle alone. The message to Western pilots was unambiguous: stray across the border, and you belong to Moscow. American military planners understood these realities with clinical precision. They mapped radar coverage, calculated response times, identified the gaps in Eastern Bloc air defense that skilled pilots could exploit. But they also recognized something that shaped every operation over European skies. Intelligence gathering couldn't stop at the Iron Curtain. What lay beyond that invisible line, Soviet troop movements, industrial capacity, communication networks, remained essential knowledge for a conflict that might erupt without warning. The solution was aircraft that served dual purposes: official missions providing cover for unofficial observation. The Douglas C-47 Skytrain had earned its reputation during World War II, hauling cargo and paratroopers across every theater of operations. Reliable, versatile, forgiving of pilot error. By 1951, hundreds remained in military service, their familiarity making them invisible in the most useful sense. A C-47 on a transport mission attracted no special attention. Its presence over European airspace was expected, routine, unremarkable. What distinguished certain C-47s from their standard counterparts was the equipment installed behind unmarked panels. Communication systems capable of monitoring frequencies that transport aircraft had no official reason to hear. Navigation instruments precise enough to document exact positions of installations glimpsed through cloud cover. Recording devices that captured everything from radar emissions to voice transmissions. The aircraft designated 43-16026 carried equipment that its crew understood only partially. They knew the instruments worked. They knew Frankfurt monitored their transmissions continuously. They knew their flights served purposes beyond the cargo manifests filed with military bureaucracy. The specifics remained classified above their clearance level. Safer that way. What you didn't know, you couldn't reveal. Erding Air Base sprawled across Bavarian farmland 30 kilometers northeast of Munich. American forces had occupied it since 1945, transforming a former Luftwaffe installation into a hub for operations across Central Europe. Transport flights departed daily for destinations throughout the Western Alliance: London, Paris, Rome, Athens, and Belgrade. Tito's Yugoslavia had broken from Soviet control in 1948, transforming overnight from enemy to potential ally. American aircraft flying to Belgrade carried diplomats, military advisors, and equipment supporting a regime that Moscow considered treasonous. These flights followed designated corridors, approved routes threading between hostile airspaces. The crew of 43 Hungary 26 had flown the Erding-Belgrade route before. 4 men with combined flight experience exceeding 30,000 hours. The pilot, a veteran of the Berlin airlift, had logged more instrument approaches in bad weather than most airmen attempted in entire careers. His co-pilot had transferred from Bomber Command, seeking the relative calm of transport duty after too many missions over Korea. The navigator carried notebooks filled with calculations, backup figures for every waypoint in case instruments failed. The radio operator maintained contact with ground stations across 3 countries, his transmissions following protocols designed to sound routine while conveying information that analysts in Frankfurt decoded in real time. They trusted their training. They trusted their equipment. They trusted the flight plan approved by officers who understood the risks of European airspace better than any crew could. None of them trusted the weather. November in Central Europe meant unpredictable conditions. Cloud banks forming without warning, wind patterns shifting across altitude gradients that meteorologists struggled to predict. The morning briefing had mentioned southwest winds at cruising altitude. Nothing unusual for the season. Standard adjustment to heading. Standard compensation for drift. The navigator had made these calculations hundreds of times. What the briefing hadn't captured was the wind's actual strength. Southwest gusts pushing harder than forecast. Steady pressure against the aircraft's heading that accumulated mile after mile into deviation no one noticed until geography itself announced the error. The route to Belgrade required threading between Austrian and Hungarian airspace, a corridor narrow enough to demand constant attention, but wide enough that small deviations stayed within acceptable margins. The navigator's calculations assumed winds matching the morning forecast. When actual conditions pushed 15% stronger, each checkpoint arrived slightly off position. Individually, the errors seemed minor. Collectively, they traced a curve bending steadily toward territory where American aircraft didn't belong. Yugoslavia in 1951 represented something unprecedented in Cold War geography. A communist nation aligned with neither bloc, Tito's government accepted American military assistance while maintaining socialist ideology that Washington officially opposed. The arrangement suited both parties. Yugoslavia gained protection against Soviet invasion. America gained a wedge driven into Eastern European solidarity, proof that Moscow's control wasn't absolute. Flights to Belgrade served this relationship directly. Every C-47 landing at Yugoslav airfields demonstrated American commitment. Every successful round trip proved that the West could maintain presence in contested regions without triggering the confrontation both superpowers feared. The missions carried genuine diplomatic cargo. They also carried something more sensitive: information gathered during the approach, observations documented through instruments that transport aircraft officially didn't possess, data transmitted to Frankfurt through channels that bypassed normal military communication. The crew of 43 the Hungary 26 understood they were participating in something larger than cargo delivery. The equipment behind sealed panels, the continuous contact with Frankfurt, the routes that skirted hostile airspace close enough to observe but not close enough to provoke, all of it suggested purposes beyond their official mission. They didn't ask questions. Career military personnel learned early that certain operations existed in spaces where curiosity was discouraged. On the morning of November 19th, they arrived at the aircraft before dawn. Pre-flight checks completed with the methodical routine of experienced professionals. Weather update reviewed, course plotted, fuel calculated for the journey with standard reserves. The sun was rising over Bavaria as engines started, propellers spinning to life in cold morning air. Erding Tower cleared them for departure at 0730 hours. The C-47 lifted into gray November sky, climbing toward cruising altitude while the navigator confirmed their heading and the radio operator established contact with Frankfurt. Routine flight, routine procedures, routine weather deviation that would push them across a border they never intended to cross. The first 40 minutes passed without incident. Checkpoint confirmation, altitude adjustment, casual conversation between crew members who had flown together long enough to anticipate each other's rhythms. The navigator checked his calculations twice, satisfied that their course remained within acceptable parameters. He didn't know that each checkpoint had arrived 3 degrees further east than his instruments indicated. That cumulative drift had already carried them beyond the corridor's edge. That Hungarian radar operators were watching their progress with growing interest, tracking a blip that shouldn't exist in their airspace. By the time anyone recognized the error, the response was already airborne. At 0847 hours, a Hungarian radar station 17 kilometers from the Austrian border flagged the contact, unscheduled, transponder indicating American military, heading that would carry it deeper into restricted airspace with every passing minute. The duty officer reached for the telephone. 40 kilometers west, the C-47 crew remained unaware. The navigator had noticed slight discrepancy in their position. Nothing alarming, well within parameters he'd experienced on previous flights. He made a small correction, confident the adjustment would bring them back on course. The radio operator continued his transmissions to Frankfurt, voice calm, tone routine. Below them, farmland gave way to forest, the landscape offering no obvious indication that they had crossed from neutral Austria into Soviet-controlled Hungary. Recognition came not from instruments, but from instinct. The pilot noticed it first. A flash of movement at 10 o'clock, too fast for commercial traffic, closing at an angle that suggested purpose rather than coincidence. Hungarian interceptors. 2 propeller-driven fighters emerged from cloud cover, their approach vectors converging on the transport aircraft with unmistakable intent. The pilot's hands tightened on the control column. He had seconds to decide. Attempt evasion in an aircraft designed for cargo, not combat. Maintain course and hope the fighters were merely escorting them back to friendly airspace. Or acknowledge the obvious truth. They were being intercepted by hostile aircraft, with orders that might include shooting them down. The radio operator's voice crackled across the frequency to Frankfurt. Contact with Hungarian military aircraft, requesting instructions. Frankfurt's response came fast but unhelpful. Maintain course. Attempt communication with interceptors. Avoid provocative maneuvers. Easy to say from a control room in West Germany. Harder to execute with fighters positioning themselves behind your aircraft. The Hungarian pilots had orders to force the American aircraft to land. Failing that, to destroy it. Their fighters carried enough armament to shred a C-47 in seconds, and their commanders had made clear that unauthorized Western aircraft over Hungarian territory represented intolerable violation of socialist sovereignty. They opened fire at 0903 hours. Tracers streaked past the transport's starboard wing, close enough that the co-pilot later described feeling the aircraft shudder from near misses. The pilot threw the C-47 into a descent it was never designed for, trading altitude for speed, while the navigator scrambled to plot any heading that might return them to Austrian airspace. Behind them, the Hungarian fighters repositioned for another pass. The second attack proved no more successful than the first, whether through pilot error, equipment malfunction, or the C-47 crew's desperate maneuvering. The Hungarian rounds failed to find their target. The transport dove through cloud layers that offered momentary concealment engines straining at power settings that exceeded every safety margin in the manual. For 90 seconds, the crew believed they might escape. The navigator had identified a heading that would carry them toward the Austrian border. The pilot held the aircraft steady, despite turbulence that threw unsecured equipment across the cabin. Frankfurt maintained contact, relaying their position to authorities who could do nothing but listen. Then, new shapes appeared in the distance. Faster than the Hungarian propeller aircraft, sleeker, unmistakable even through scattered clouds, MiG-15s, Soviet fighters operating from Hungarian bases, scrambled to accomplish what their satellite allies had failed to achieve. The swept-wing jets closed the distance in seconds, their speed differential rendering any thought of escape absurd. One positioned itself directly ahead of the C-47, forcing the pilot to choose between collision and compliance. The other settled behind them, its weapons armed and its pilot's finger resting on the trigger. The message required no translation: follow or die. The pilot reduced power. The navigator stopped calculating escape routes. The radio operator transmitted their situation to Frankfurt in clipped phrases that carried the weight of surrender. They were being forced down onto hostile territory with no possibility of rescue and no option but cooperation. The MiGs guided them eastward, deeper into Hungarian airspace, toward a military installation the crew had never seen on any chart they were cleared to carry. Papa Air Base materialized through the clouds, runways, hangars, armed personnel already gathering to receive the prize that Soviet air power was delivering. The C-47's wheels touched Hungarian concrete at 9:31 hours. From navigational error to forced landing, the entire sequence had consumed less than 45 minutes. The crew had escaped the Hungarian guns only to land directly in Soviet hands. The propellers hadn't stopped spinning when the first vehicles appeared. Military trucks converging from multiple directions, disgorging soldiers who formed a perimeter around the aircraft with weapons raised. Hungarian uniforms mixed with Soviet, the satellite state and its master working in practice coordination. Within 90 seconds of touchdown, the C-47 sat at the center of a closing ring of armed men who viewed its crew not as prisoners of war, but as criminals caught violating sovereign territory. The pilot kept his hands visible on the control column. Any sudden movement now could end in gunfire. A Soviet officer approached the aircraft door, his uniform marking him as state security rather than regular military. Behind him walked two men in civilian clothes carrying equipment cases. Technical specialists summoned the moment radar confirmed an American aircraft entering Hungarian airspace. They had been waiting at Papa for exactly this opportunity. Captured Western aircraft were rare prizes, and the protocols for exploiting them had been refined through years of Cold War confrontation. The crew emerged one by one, hands raised, squinting in pale November light. Hungarian soldiers patted them down while Soviet officers watched with the patient attention of scientists observing specimens. Sidearms confiscated, flight documents seized, personal effects cataloged with bureaucratic thoroughness that transformed capture into paperwork. No one spoke English. The crew's attempts at communication met blank stares or dismissive gestures. They were escorted to a windowless building at the airfield's edge, separated into individual rooms, left alone with guards who offered neither explanation nor response to questions asked in languages they didn't understand. Meanwhile, the aircraft received different treatment. Soviet technical officers circled the C-47 with the reverence of archaeologists approaching an undisturbed tomb. They photographed every angle before touching anything. They noted serial numbers, manufacturing stamps, maintenance markings that revealed where the aircraft had been serviced and by whom. The external examination alone consumed 2 hours, each observation recorded in notebooks that would eventually reach analysts in Moscow. The crew, watching from barred windows when guards allowed, understood what was happening. Every minute the Soviets spent with that aircraft was another minute of American secrets being documented, analyzed, prepared for exploitation. The equipment behind those sealed panels, equipment the crew had been trained never to discuss, was about to receive the most thorough examination Soviet intelligence could provide. Inside the interrogation building, the four Americans faced a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Cooperate and perhaps survive. Resist and certainly suffer. The Soviets had refined their methods through decades of practice, and American military personnel captured in hostile territory operated under guidelines that acknowledged an uncomfortable reality. Everyone breaks eventually. The question was only how long resistance could be maintained and at what cost. The first interrogation session began at 1400 hours, less than 5 hours after the aircraft had left Erding on what was supposed to be a routine flight to Belgrade. Soviet intelligence officers approached captured equipment the way surgeons approached complicated operations: methodical, patient. Every incision deliberate, every observation documented before proceeding to the next. The C-47 sitting on Papa's tarmac represented years of American engineering, months of specialized modification, and secrets that Moscow had been trying to acquire through espionage networks that produced only fragments. Now, the complete artifact sat before them, intact and accessible, waiting to surrender everything it contained. The lead technical officer was a colonel named Volkov, a specialist in Western aviation technology who had examined captured American aircraft since the final days of World War II. His team included radio engineers, navigation experts, and 2 analysts whose specific expertise remained classified even within Soviet military intelligence. They worked in 12-hour shifts, ensuring continuous examination while maintaining the mental acuity that detailed analysis required. Their first discovery came within 30 minutes of boarding. The communication equipment wasn't standard transport configuration. Frequencies available exceeded anything required for routine military traffic. The radio could monitor bands used by air defense installations, ground-based radar stations, and encrypted diplomatic channels. For a cargo aircraft officially flying between Allied bases, such capability was inexplicable through any legitimate purpose. Volkov documented everything before touching anything. Photographs from multiple angles, measurements recorded to the millimeter, serial numbers traced and cataloged for later comparison with intelligence databases that might reveal manufacturing sources and modification facilities. The methodical pace frustrated junior officers eager for faster results, but Volkov understood something they hadn't yet learned. Evidence preserved carefully was evidence that could be exploited indefinitely. Evidence disturbed carelessly was evidence that might lose its value before analysts fully understood what they possessed. The navigation instruments revealed similar anomalies: precision exceeding transport requirements, calibration standards matching reconnaissance aircraft rather than cargo haulers. One device, a specialized compass system, appeared nowhere in official C-47 documentation. Its presence suggested modifications performed outside normal military supply chains, equipment installed by personnel whose work didn't appear in maintenance records that could be subpoenaed or leaked. Behind a panel in the cargo bay, technicians discovered the aircraft's true purpose: recording equipment connected to external sensors capable of capturing radar emissions, radio frequencies, and electromagnetic signatures from installations the aircraft passed during flight. The system was dormant when found. Crew had apparently deactivated it during the interception, but its design revealed capabilities that Soviet engineers would spend months analyzing and years attempting to replicate. What the technical team didn't know was that 3 items were missing. In the desperate minutes between the MiGs forcing them down, and Hungarian soldiers surrounding the aircraft, the crew had hidden what they could. Classified maps showing approved reconnaissance corridors near Soviet borders, town plans for Eastern European cities with military installations marked in code, a cipher book that would have revealed how American intelligence communicated with assets operating behind the Iron Curtain. The navigator had stuffed the maps beneath insulation in the aircraft's tail section. The radio operator had buried the cipher book inside a panel that required tools to access. The pilot had taken the most dangerous risk, concealing town plans inside his flight suit before exiting the aircraft and praying that the cursory search wouldn't discover documents pressed against his skin. The search missed them. Initially, Hungarian soldiers focused on weapons and obvious documents, their training adequate for capturing enemy combatants, but insufficient for the detailed examination that intelligence exploitation required. When Soviet technical officers took control of the aircraft, they began their work at the nose and proceeded systematically backward, a process that would reach the tail section only after days of careful progression through everything that came before. The pilot's concealment lasted longer. His flight suit underwent inspection, but the documents were thin enough and positioned carefully enough that distracted guards felt nothing suspicious. He maintained rigid posture throughout the search, controlling his breathing through techniques learned during survival training that had always seemed theoretical until this moment. But comprehensive interrogation followed different protocols than field searches. The questioning began with biographical details: name, rank, service number, the information every captured soldier was authorized to provide under international conventions that the Soviets acknowledged selectively. Hours passed in repetitive exchanges that seemed designed more to establish patterns than extract information. The interrogators noted how each crew member responded to stress. Who showed fear? Who maintained composure? Who might break first? Day 2 introduced pressure, sleep deprivation, irregular meals, questions repeated with slight variations, testing whether answers remained consistent or revealed contradictions that suggested deception. The crew had trained for this. All American military personnel operating near hostile territory received instruction in resistance techniques, but training couldn't fully prepare anyone for the reality of Soviet interrogation conducted by specialists who had refined their methods through countless previous subjects. The navigator broke first. Not completely, not catastrophically, but enough. Under sustained questioning about flight procedures, he mentioned backup documents carried for navigation emergencies. The interrogator noted the plural, documents. The crew's official manifest listed only standard charts that had already been recovered. What other documents? The navigator tried to retreat, claiming confusion, language difficulty, misunderstanding. But Soviet interrogators recognized evasion the way musicians recognized wrong notes. The questioning intensified, focused now on a specific gap between what the manifest claimed and what the crew had actually carried aboard the aircraft. Technicians received new instructions. Examine everything again. Every panel, every seam, every space large enough to conceal paper. The maps surfaced on day 3. A technician noticed insulation disturbed in patterns inconsistent with manufacturing or normal wear. Behind it lay documents that made Soviet analysts pause their systematic approach and request immediate communication with Moscow. Detailed charts of airspace near Soviet installations, approved corridors for reconnaissance approaches, evidence that American aircraft were conducting systematic surveillance of Eastern Bloc military capabilities under cover of routine transport missions. The cipher book emerged hours later, discovered when an engineer examining the radio equipment noticed a panel that showed tool marks inconsistent with factory assembly. The book itself was small, pages of apparently random letter groups that meant nothing without the corresponding key, but its existence confirmed that the aircraft served intelligence purposes requiring secure communication. the pilot's concealment lasted until day 4. A physician conducting medical examination of the crew noticed paper edges visible through sweat-stained fabric. Town plans for 3 cities emerged from inside his flight suit, their coded markings revealing American intelligence. Interest in industrial facilities, communication centers, and transportation nodes that would become priority targets in any future conflict. The Soviet assessment crystallized over the following week. The C-47 hadn't been merely a transport aircraft that wandered off course through navigational error. It was an active intelligence platform, part of a systematic American effort to monitor Soviet and satellite state capabilities through missions disguised as routine military logistics. The equipment aboard represented current American reconnaissance technology. The documents revealed operational planning for surveillance programs extending across Eastern Europe. The crew, despite their training in resistance, had confirmed through interrogation that such missions occurred regularly along every accessible corridor approaching the Iron Curtain. For Moscow, the captured aircraft was vindication. Soviet leadership had long claimed that American military flights near their borders served espionage purposes rather than legitimate transport needs. Western governments dismissed these accusations as paranoid propaganda. Now physical evidence supported what the Soviets had always asserted. The transport aircraft was a surveillance platform. The routine missions were intelligence gathering. The border violations that American officials attributed to weather and navigation error were systematic probes of Eastern Bloc defenses. Hungarian authorities received instructions to pursue maximum prosecution. The crew would be tried publicly, their conviction serving both domestic propaganda purposes and international messaging about American duplicity. The aircraft would be retained permanently, studied until every secret it contained had been extracted, then preserved as evidence of Western aggression against socialist nations. The technical examination continued for 3 months. Soviet engineers documented systems they hadn't known existed, capabilities they hadn't anticipated, and technological approaches they would spend years attempting to duplicate. Reports flowed to Moscow weekly, each one adding detail to an emerging picture of American intelligence operations that extended far beyond what any previous source had revealed. A senior analyst summarized the capture's significance in language that reached Stalin's desk. One aircraft has told us more about American reconnaissance methodology than 5 years of espionage. The crew had revealed little under interrogation, maintaining resistance that their training had prepared them for. But the aircraft itself had no such loyalty. It surrendered everything to patient examination that continued long after its crew faced trial. The documents found hidden aboard confirmed suspicions that had driven Soviet air defense policy since the Cold War began. Every American transport aircraft approaching Eastern Bloc airspace was potentially hostile. Every routine flight might carry equipment designed to penetrate socialist secrecy. The border was not just geography to be defended, but a front line in an invisible war where the weapons were instruments and the casualties were secrets. The trial convened in Budapest 3 weeks after the capture, conducted in Hungarian with translators who rendered accusations into English the defendants could understand. The courtroom was arranged for propaganda as much as justice. Cameras positioned to capture American military officers standing before socialist authority. Journalists from state media filling seats reserved for observers who would report exactly what the government wanted reported. The charges were straightforward: violation of Hungarian airspace, illegal entry into sovereign territory, espionage conducted under cover of military transport. The evidence presented included photographs of the aircraft, technical assessments of its equipment, and the documents recovered from hiding places the crew had believed secure. Prosecutors described each item with theatrical precision, building a narrative of American aggression that matched Soviet messaging about Western intentions towards socialist nations. The crew's defense was limited by circumstances that made meaningful argument impossible. They couldn't deny presence over Hungarian territory. Radar records and their own forced landing confirmed that reality. They couldn't explain the specialized equipment without revealing classified information that their training prohibited them from discussing under any circumstances. They couldn't account for hidden documents that clearly served intelligence purposes beyond anything routine transport required. Guilty verdicts arrived on all charges. The sentence carried both punishment and message. Each crew member was fined 360,000 Hungarian forints, a sum equivalent to several years of average Hungarian wages, designed to quantify American violation in terms the domestic audience would understand. The aircraft was confiscated permanently, declared property of the Hungarian state, though everyone understood it would spend its remaining existence in Soviet technical facilities being studied by engineers who would extract every secret its construction contained. The crew themselves received a punishment that served diplomatic purposes more than punitive ones. Expulsion from Hungary, return to American custody through channels that allowed both governments to claim resolution while avoiding the prolonged confrontation that indefinite imprisonment would have created. They crossed into Austria 17 days after their forced landing, thin and exhausted but alive, carrying experiences they would spend decades being debriefed about and the rest of their lives being prohibited from discussing publicly. Washington's official response maintained the fiction that had justified the flight originally: navigational error, weather conditions, unfortunate accident rather than intentional penetration of hostile airspace. State Department. Communications expressed regret for the inadvertent border crossing while rejecting characterizations of the aircraft as a spy plane conducting surveillance operations. The Soviets responded with documentation that made American denials difficult to sustain. Technical specifications of equipment no transport aircraft legitimately required. Photographs of hidden documents that served no purpose except intelligence gathering. Transcripts from interrogations where crew members, under pressure, had acknowledged aspects of their mission that contradicted official American accounts. Neither government expected the other to admit truth publicly. That wasn't how Cold War diplomacy functioned. But the incident established facts that shaped subsequent operations on both sides. American reconnaissance flights adopted new protocols, routes adjusted to reduce vulnerability, equipment modified to allow faster destruction if capture became imminent. Soviet air defense intensified surveillance of transport corridors, treating every Western aircraft approaching their sphere as potential intelligence platform until proven otherwise. The aircraft designated 43 Wungstino-26 never flew again. Hungarian records indicate it was transported to a Soviet facility in 1952, where technical examination continued for at least another year. What happened afterward remains classified in archives that subsequent Russian governments have shown no interest in opening. The aircraft may have been preserved as a training exhibit, demonstrating American methodology to generations of Soviet intelligence officers. It may have been dismantled completely, every component analyzed until nothing remained worth studying. It may still exist somewhere, a Cold War artifact waiting in some forgotten hangar for historians who will never receive permission to examine it. The crew returned to careers shaped by their capture. Debriefings lasted months, every detail of interrogation documented, every question the Soviets asked analyzed for what it revealed about their intelligence priorities. The men received commendations that couldn't be publicized, recognition for maintaining resistance under conditions that broke many other prisoners. They continued serving, their experience informing training programs that prepared subsequent generations for capture scenarios they hoped would never occur. None of them spoke publicly about what happened at Papa. Classification restrictions prohibited disclosure, and personal inclination reinforced official silence. Some experiences resist narration. Some memories are easier carried privately than shared with audiences who couldn't understand what Soviet interrogation rooms felt like at 3 in the morning when sleep deprivation had erased the boundary between resistance and confession. The incident joined a catalog of Cold War confrontations that accumulated through the 1950s and beyond. Aircraft shot down, crews captured, diplomatic protests exchanged and forgotten. Each event demonstrated the same underlying reality. The skies over Europe had become contested space where navigational error could trigger international crisis and routine missions could end in foreign prisons. What does the C-47 forced down at Papa reveal about the world that produced it? That superpowers conducted invisible warfare through instruments and infiltration while maintaining public pretense of peaceful coexistence. That secrets traveled aboard aircraft whose crews understood only fragments of what they carried. That borders existed as legal fictions easily violated by wind patterns and compass drift, yet defended with fighter interceptors and interrogation cells that made violation consequential. The flight from Erding to Belgrade was supposed to take 3 hours. Instead, it produced an international incident, exposed American intelligence methodology, provided Soviet analysts with equipment they spent years studying, and demonstrated that the Iron Curtain was simultaneously penetrable and dangerous. Papa Air Base still operates today. NATO aircraft now use runways where the C-47 touched down under Soviet escort. Pilots land without knowing what happened there in November 1951. Their routine approaches crossing ground where 4 American airmen surrendered to armed soldiers speaking languages they couldn't understand. The interrogation buildings have been demolished or repurposed. The hangars that sheltered captured American aircraft now service different planes serving different alliances. Nothing marks the location because that's how the Cold War worked. Incidents that seemed catastrophic in their moment dissolved into archives that governments preferred to forget. Crews who endured capture became footnotes in classified histories that may never be fully declassified. Aircraft that revealed secrets worth dying for became scrap metal or museum pieces stripped of the equipment that made them valuable. The skies over Hungary are quiet now. Commercial flights cross the same airspace where MiG-15s once forced American transports onto hostile runways. Passengers look down at farmland and forest without knowing they're passing over invisible boundaries that once divided the world into armed camps prepared for wars that never quite arrived. But somewhere in those archives, American, Russian, Hungarian, the records remain. Flight logs and interrogation transcripts, technical assessments and diplomatic cables, the complete documentation of one November morning when routine became catastrophe, and 4 men discovered exactly how thin the line was between Allied airspace and enemy territory. Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this investigation into Cold War aerial confrontation changed how you see the invisible wars fought above our heads, hit that like button and share this video. Subscribe because we're exposing the operations that governments classified and the machinery of intelligence that operated in permanent shadow. Hit the notification bell. The next buried incident is already waiting in the archives, ready to be revealed.